The Ripper Case by Alex Loudin. Let me introduce myself. My name is Jack, Dr. Jack Batchumber. I work as a medical surgeon for both the mentally sound and unsound. More often than not, I would be working on the mentally ill and some who are badly hurt. Now enough with my rambling and on to where this story begins and why I'm in the situation that I'm in. This is a story of how I was accused of being Jack the Ripper. They pointed the finger at me because I am a genius and for the fact that I'm a surgeon. So I was a prime suspect because who would think twice about suspecting a surgeon to make these horrific attacks? So I decided to help them find the man responsible for everything. I was put in a small empty room that was dimly lit with 2 chairs and a medium-sized table for questioning. 2 officers came in shortly after, and one of the officers was a tall, gauntly, clean-cut-looking man, while the other was a short, rounded man with mutton chops with an English moustache. "Hello, sir, how are you doing today?" the short one asked in the most sincere and wholesome tone of voice. "I'm doing well, just a bit on the queasy side on why I'm here," I replied with a timid tone. "Oh, there's no need to worry, sir. We are only going to ask you a few questions and then you can go home and be on your merrily way. Sound good?" He spoke in a soothing tone to ease my nerves. "Okay, I'll answer to the best of my abilities," I reassured him. The other officer, however, just rolled his eyes in disbelief, as if he knew that I was the killer and was just nervous about the fact that I had been caught. All right, enough with this niceness charade, and let's just get to the questions, shall we? As you may know, there have been 5 known murders, maybe even more, that are unbeknownst to us. So the question at hand is, you wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you, Doctor? The tall officer commanded an answer or even a confession. "No, but I've heard about them before, but I don't know anything further than that," I replied with false confidence to hide the fact that he had scared me with his questioning assumption that I would possibly know or could have done the things that he had mentioned. The gaunt-looking officer just scowled at me in disbelief as if I had just lied right in front of him. "Listen here. We know that the killer had to have great skills in cutting his victims the way he did. He was also able to remove the bodily organs with ease and," he continued to say, but unfortunately I had to stop him before he went too far with his words. Excuse me, sir." I paused to try and stop myself from making a sound and to possibly prevent myself from getting sick. "If I may ask, could you please stop before I become sick?" I asked, covering my mouth and trying to fight off my queasiness and not get sick in front of the officers. He looked at me with an irritated glare as if I had insulted him in some way. "But aren't you a surgeon, sir? Shouldn't you be used to the fact that I would be describing what you would see on an operation table?" He spoke with an arrogant smile as if he had caught me in a lie and that I was a usual suspect. "Believe me when I say this, I know that it seems rather odd, but what you are talking about is mutilation and not surgery. I'm a doctor, not a murderer." I replied to the officer and he was caught off guard by my statement. Then the short officer spoke. "While he is a surgeon, there are differences between the 2 fields. For example, one is a profession while the other is a horrendous crime." He spoke genuinely as he had vouched for me. The tall one angrily glared at his partner and began to become angrier as he thought I was insane. This had gone on for hours until we all had heard a cry for help followed shortly after by a shriek of terror. The tall, angry officer looked furiously while his shorter partner looked horrified. They brought me along because the angry officer didn't trust me to be alone and cuffed me while we went in the direction of the cry-by carriage as I was put in the back where criminals go. We arrived at the scene of the crime. Both officers left me in the police carriage to prevent me from escaping as I had committed the crime. Moments go by and other officers crowd in the crime scene and talk amongst themselves to try and come up with reasoning as to why and how the crime was committed. I glanced over to see that some of the officers and detectives couldn't bear to witness the sight of what they were looking at. The short, jolly officer made his way to the carriage. He had a look that was very apologetic, as if he were to ask me to do something that I hated. "Sir," he started and paused to collect his words, "I know that these types of things may very well be horrifying to you, but could you possibly please come and look at the bodies so that we would know what we're looking for or that we are looking at the same guy?" He finished scarcely with a regretful tone. I looked at him with a smile and spoke. "Well, I'll try to take a look. Anything to help, I'll gladly oblige." I responded, reassuring him that I was with him. He then took me out of the carriage carefully as if to not hurt me. He even led me to the crime scene but treated me as a normal person and not a criminal like the other officer would have. I smelled the stench of death and decay in the air, as if some of the bodies were there for a long period. The other officers just stood around covering their noses to keep out the smell of rotting flesh, and some had to wait outside of the room where the recent victim was at. The small officer turned and looked horrified and spoke. Now I'm warning you. In that room it is very gruesome." He spoke to me in a comforting voice, even though he was terrified of what was found. He then uncuffed me so that I was able to examine the corpse closely and how the wounds were made on the body. I had told him to wait outside as I went into the room and to spare him from seeing the body more than he needed. The tall officer glared at me with an angry look as he saw me enter the room. "What are you doing here? You should be in the carriage where you belong." The tall officer commanded an answer. I looked at him with a stern look as he glared, snarling at me. "I just came to help out with the problem. I am a surgeon after all, isn't that why you brought me along?" I responded, and noticed that he hated the answer I provided and turned to walk back to the spot he came from. I then examined the body as he continued to give me a hateful glare. I had never seen such a horrendous sight before in my life. The lacerations were careless, as if the killer hadn't cared about how he killed or who he killed as long as his prey was dead. He'd have been happy, however. There were careful cuts as if to remove certain bodily organs. As I looked at the victim's lifeless body, I began to feel myself getting sick. I immediately got up and walked away from the body and covered my mouth to stop myself from becoming sick and ruining what we may have gotten from the poor woman. The tall officer then growled at me. "Well, so what all was it then, huh?" He spoke in an angered tone. I tried to clear my head and collect my thoughts and tried not to think about the horrendous sight of the victim. "Well," I began scarcely. "She was butchered and some of her organs are gone," I responded with a frightened tone in my voice. I was horrified by the macabre of how someone could do this sort of thing, and worse, to even think about doing it as well. The tall officer looked smug and had a smirk as if he had caught something that I was unaware of. "So," he began and paused for effect, "a surgeon. Did all of this then, huh? Very suspicious, wouldn't you say, Dr. Batchumber, the renowned surgeon?" He spoke in a mocking tone as he was accusing me of the mutilation of the victim. I said that she was butchered. That was, or is in this case, the cause of death and not the careful removal of her organs, officer. A person can still live if you remove one of their organs the right way, but not by being butchered beforehand. I paused to collect myself to not be angered by his false accusations. So more than likely we are looking for a butcher who got bored of butchering the animals he serves at his shop and does unto the people like his new prey for an undesired want by his unsound mind. I finished my response to the tall, irate officer. His response was to walk off angrier than he was before. I, in return, walked to the entrance to find the smaller officer so he could take me back to the carriage. As I got closer to him, I saw that he was sitting on the steps near the entrance of the building and noticed that he was looking at a photograph of a woman. I sat right next to him and spoke. "Who might the lovely lady be? Your daughter, perhaps?" I spoke to him to try and start up a conversation to try and make his mind at ease from the scene of the crime. He smiled and proudly said, "No, she's my wife. Looks like an angel, huh?" He spoke, still looking at the picture in his hands. "Yes, you're a lucky man and seems as if she is a lucky lady to have a good man such as yourself." I responded with a smile to lighten things up. He smiles bigger and from ear to ear as he pats me on the back and knowing the fact that he had made a new friend. "So, what is her name and yours, if you don't mind me asking?" I asked to further our conversation to put his mind at ease more. "Her name is Rebecca, and I'm Officer Petter." He gleefully spoke. I straightened my tie and introduced myself. "I'm Dr. Jack Batchumber." I spoke confidently. No relation to the other Jack." I finished jokingly, and as he chuckled, I asked, "So what's Mr. Sunshine and Rainbow's name?" "Edward. His name is Officer Edward." Petter responded with a smile. Now I know their names, and at that moment Officer Edward came out and grabbed me by my collar to pull me aside jerkingly to question me further. As he threw me against the wall, he glared with a rage-filled look and spoke hatefully. "Just how did you know that she was butchered right away, huh?" He spoke harshly. "You got something to do with this, don't you, Dr. Batchumber?" he asked demandingly. I looked him in the eyes as I spoke. "I'm a surgeon by trade." I started. "I should know a bad job of cutting when I see one, shouldn't I?" I responded with the same tone as he had used. He didn't like my response and held me as he hit me in the gut with his police bat. Petter saw what had happened and jumped in to break up the fight that had ensued. "He just answered your question, Edward, just the way you asked him to." Petter spoke as he confronted his partner to defuse the situation. Edward looked puzzled as Petter spoke up. Well, he didn't have to sound like a wiseacre to me doing so. He spoke harshly. Petter looked crossly at Edward. "Well, maybe if you weren't accusing him of stuff that he didn't do and trying to make him look bad, maybe you'd get some respect." He spoke with a pause to calm himself so he wouldn't say something that he'd regret. You need to show respect to him to get respect. Petter stood up to Edward for me. Officer Edward looked even more enraged and walked back to the carriage because he knew that he was in the wrong. Don't think too low of him, Petter stated to me. He's just angry that we haven't caught Jack the Ripper yet, even though that still doesn't give him the right to do that. Petter tried to apologize for his partner's actions. I knew that I had to say something to keep Petter at ease, and to not show that I was angry, and to reassure him that I didn't think too lowly of his partner. I forgave him already, or I understand what he's going through, or something along those lines. I understand that he must be feeling stressed over the killer still being at large, so I wouldn't hold a grudge over him for his actions. I finally responded to Petter with a genuine look. He began to look relieved as he heard me say the things I had told him. We then got back in the carriage and headed back to the jailhouse because there were no leads left to follow up on. It was as if the man wanted us to know that it was him all along, but for some God-forsaken reason, he didn't want us to know where he was. Oddly enough, it's either or, but in this case, it's both. As we made it back, I headed back to the questioning room that I was put in because I assumed that there was more questioning to be had. Petter then came and got me so that I could help out with figuring out who it could be. As Petter and I made our way to another room where we would be discussing our plan of action, Edward began to speak as we sat down. As I was told, we have 7 suspects. One's a butcher, one's a surgeon, a prostitute, a jealous friend, family member, neighbour, or a rogue pimp. Edward told the group sternly. Petter looked puzzled at the list Edward spoke of. Why would we need to investigate a pimp? Was she a streetwalker? He spoke in a hushed tone as if he had talked in a vulgar way and so the others wouldn't hear him. Yes, she was a famous one at that. So she'll have to have had enemies in her field of work. Edward responded. I spoke up. Okay, so are we going to each one individually or all together? Edward looked cross at me as if to wonder why I even came and responded with, we'll call them in and interrogate them that way so we'd have an upper hand. Petter spoke, pondering his idea. Why don't we just go and talk to each one instead of asking them to come here? Because wouldn't we be able to catch them in a lie at their place of work? Or if there is more than one, they could tip the other off to form a plan of action of their own without our knowing, Petter asked Edward. I looked surprised as to how he was able to come up with a great plan like that. Edward then second-guessed himself and went with Petter's idea because it was better sounding and made more sense to catch them off guard and catch them before they could pull a fast one on us. I then pondered the thought of what if they tried to escape. They'd know exactly where to go. So I pulled Petter aside and asked privately, and he responded with, not to worry. The buildings will be surrounded and they'll have no way out without an officer knowing it first. I then figured out why Edward is so furious all the time. It is because Petter is a better police officer. So do we just go and question the rest of the suspects after we're done with one, or do we wait? I wondered and asked Petter. He smiled and replied, Oh, we will, but first let us call it a day and get some supper, shall we? My wife cooks a lot of delicious food for my daughter, her and myself. How about you join us? Petter asked me as he smiled and genuinely meant what he said. It caught me by surprise. One moment he and Edward were asking me questions about that dreaded Jack the Ripper monster, and now I've made a friend who has invited me to dinner. I paused to collect my words to not sound nervous. Don't know, Officer Petter. I don't want to intrude. I responded politely. He just smiled to reassure me that I wasn't going to be an intrusion at all. Oh no, you wouldn't be intruding at all, Doctor. Plus she always makes thirds and you'll have plenty to eat. He responded with a pat on my back and a warm gesture of kindness. I smiled back. Well, okay then. You have persuaded me to join you, my friend. I responded with a joking tone. He smiled with a chuckle, and then we made it to his home. It was an interesting walk because he had told me all that he and his partner have been through, their ups and downs. Petter had shown me a picture that he got with Edward when they were first recruited. I never knew that Edward could smile, and to be honest, I never would have believed it until he showed me a picture. I then asked what had happened to make him bitter. Petter just looked at me and smiled. Well, he started. There was a case that had to be solved and he was the only one that was available at the time. Petter paused for a moment. My daughter was born that day and I had to be by her side. He insisted that I go and be with her in the hospital and that he'd take the rookie to break him in. He looked down and nearly teared up, but he continued to explain. I was very appreciative about it and went to the hospital as fast as I could run. He paused and made a joke. I used to be a lot thinner back then, but now I let my wife bake and here I am now, ha ha. He spoke jolly-like. He then explained what else happened, and I was shocked by his words. They made it to a murder scene, and it was something out of a horror story. Edward had become scared for his life for the first time. The rookie heard a noise and decided to go and investigate it further. Edward was too frightened and wanted to get back up, but the rookie said that the guy would be long gone before they got back. And then he heard a gunshot followed by the rookie's screams. Petter stopped to catch his breath for a moment. I spoke. "It's okay if you can't tell me. I'll understand." I told him so that he didn't have to relive a terrifying memory, and he looked at me and said, No, it's fine. I'll tell you so that you'll understand where he's coming from, and that he doesn't mean all of what he says and for acting in a hateful manner." He replied and continued his story. Edward had to follow the muffled screams of the rookie as he was being stabbed to death. He then found them and saw something horrifying, and took aim, then shot the perpetrator. He wasn't the same after that. We had gotten reports of what had happened, and the other officers found him on his knees covered in blood. He didn't speak and lost his smile. I never knew the rookie's name, and it's a very touchy subject for him to talk about, so I just try to make his days better by being the nice copper and letting him know that everyone isn't all that bad. He stopped, and I had to let all that sink in. So much has happened. Before I knew it, we were at his home. His home was beautiful, and interestingly, it was in a place that was surrounded by poverty. We then walked up to his door, and as he got to it, the door swung open, and there to greet him was his daughter with the same love and joy that is in her father's eyes. She had a smile that was from ear to ear, and she looked genuinely happy and not sad at all. He kneeled, and she ran into his arms and kissed him on his cheek as if he had been gone for far too long. I then saw a woman in the hallway whipping her hands with a cloth that had seemed worn, and she too had a great big smile. I looked in awe that there could be a family like this in such a run-down place, and not to mention be happy. After his daughter was done hugging her father, his wife came to give him the same greeting as she wholesomely kissed him, as if it were their first time. She then led him into their living room so he could be warmed up with their love from the cold, cruel world that we had come from. I just stood in the doorway admiring the way that everyone acted towards each other, and wishing to myself that I wanted that as well. I imagined myself having a wife and 2 kids as I saw how happy Petter and his family are. I then broke out of that trance as his lovely wife spoke. "Oh well, who might this be, dear?" she asked in a soft, caring voice. He smiled and looked at me, gesturing me to come in and stay a while. "Oh yes, that's Dr. Batchumber. He's a friend of mine from work." He introduced me as I walked into his home, holding my hat in one hand and holding out the other to shake her hand. "I'm Jack Batchumber. How are you lovely ladies doing this fine evening?" I introduced myself with a greeting and tried to sound as gentlemanly as possible. Petter just grinned ear to ear, and his daughter held onto her father's arm as she giggled at what I had said, and his wife Rebecca bowed and spoke. "Oh, why, thank you, kind sir," she said as she began to shake my hand, and then their daughter introduced herself. "Hi, I'm Alexandria Ann." She spoke excitedly and bubbly. I got down on my knee and said, "What a lovely name, little miss." I replied as I kissed her hand. She then giggled and went to her mother's side and was a little embarrassed, and as I stood up smiling and thinking to myself that they were truly a happy family. They all shared a big smile, and I was just wondering how they could be a happy few even though the world wasn't such a happy place. Rebecca looked at me and asked, "Will you be staying with us for supper? We have room for another plate." Rebecca tried to persuade me to stay. I responded with, "I appreciate the offer, but Petter here already talked me into it." I finished and her happy smile grew bigger. She looked over at her daughter and spoke, "Honey, help me get the table ready." Rebecca told her daughter, "Okay, Mummy." Alexandria Ann responded. I looked around the place and I was astonished at how lovely it was. Petter then began to talk to me. "You know you just made her week, right?" He spoke to me genuinely. "Really? How's that?" I asked him. He smiled and spoke, "Because she does so loves to cook for people. She's a baker, you know." Petter spoke proudly of his wife. I thought that was fascinating and responded, "Well then I bet you get a lot of the best sweets since she's a baker then, huh?" I responded with a smile. His eyes lit up. "Oh yes, ha ha ha," he responded excitedly. "She's the best. As a matter of fact, she's better than a ton of the other bakers in the world." He finished with a huge grin, admiring his wife from the living room as she got dinner set up in the dining room. As the smell of delicious food came to my nose, I began to feel excited to taste the food that she had prepared for us all, and maybe if I'm lucky I'll get some desserts. Petter saw me thinking of food and sweets and smiled as he led me to the dining room kitchen to sit at the table so we all could eat together. As everyone began to take their seat at the table, I stood there hesitating to take a seat. I waited a bit to figure out where to sit. The table was set so beautifully and the food looked too good to eat. "So, Mr. Batchumber, what is it that you do for a living?" she asked. "If you don't mind me asking, that is." Rebecca finished. I swallowed the food that was in my mouth so that I wouldn't be rude. "Oh no, not at all." I cleared my throat and said, "I'm a surgeon. I help people get better faster." I responded as I saw that Alexandria Ann was surprised when I said that I was a surgeon. "A doctor?" Alexandria Ann asked, surprised. "Yes, that's right," I responded. She smiled a big smile and began to say, "I want to be a doctor someday too." She spoke excitedly and I saw her parents smile. Peta began to speak. "Yes, that's all she talks about. She wants to heal people and make them better than when they come into the hospital." Peta spoke proudly of his daughter. "How good are you, Mr. Dr. Batchumber?" Alexandria Ann asked, with her eyes full of curiosity. "I'd say probably one of, if not the best where I work," I responded. She looked down to collect her words and courage to ask me a question. "Do you think I'll be as good as you one day?" she asked confidently. I looked her in the eyes and spoke. "In my honest opinion." I paused to look as if I were thinking, no. Both she and her parents looked surprised. Then I said, "I think you'll be better than I ever will be." I finished and saw that she grew a smile that was so infectious that it made everyone and could make anyone smile with her. We all began to have seconds and talk about the day that we've all had. We all began to laugh together and tell funny stories to each other. As the night went on, we finished the feast that Rebecca had made for us. Rebecca and her daughter Alexandria Ann began to clean up the table. Alexandria went to clean the dishes, and Rebecca began to clear the table. I offered to help clean the room, but Rebecca assured me that it wasn't necessary and thanked me for the kind gesture. I made my way to the living room after I thanked Rebecca for the lovely meal that she so kindly had me a part of, and everyone is so happy. I saw Peta and went up to him to talk. "Hey, Peta, can I ask you something?" I asked him nervously and privately. "Yeah, of course. Why, is there something wrong?" he asked in response. I looked him in the eyes. "No, nothing's wrong. I'd like to I paused as I tried to collect my words. "I was wondering why you three are so happy, even though life isn't all sunshine and colourful," I asked him sheepishly. He looks at me and smiles as he puts a hand on my shoulder. "Well, just because something lacks colour or is dull, you just got to add colour to it." He told me to ease my thoughts. If you find yourself in a dark room, you just got to add sunshine to it, and not only will you brighten your way, you'll just brighten the way of others as well. Peta finished with heartfelt reasoning, and I was moved by his words. Peta then offered for me to stay the night, and I had to decline because I had something to do at my home. He then offered to escort me home, but I told him I'd rather him stay at home because it'd make me feel better knowing that the family was safe. They all wished me a farewell and a safe passage home. I nodded and thanked them, as well as wished them a farewell and a good night. As I began to walk further away from his home in the night, the darkness began to grow bigger and bigger as there was little to no light. I began to feel scared and helpless. I felt a monstrous shadow follow me. I looked back to see if I was right. To my surprise, I saw a lurking shadow just standing in an alleyway waiting for me to make a move. I began to walk faster as if I had never seen the shadow before. I felt as if it were following close behind me. I felt a shadowy hand on me getting closer to my throat as bad thoughts began to wrap around my mind. I thought for a moment that I was going to die and be the next victim. Then I remember hearing Peta's voice say, "Add sunshine to a dark room." I then began to see the world in a new light. I felt safer, and all of a sudden I felt warmer. The lurking shadow began to go away, and I no longer felt a hand grasping at my throat. I've walked for hours and finally made it home. I went in and saw that there was no colour, so I decided to add it like what Peta had told me. I locked up my house and went back into town to add colour to liven it up. As I made it to town, some of its residents were homeless and begging for what little they could have just so they could feed their families. I rummaged around in my pocket to see if I could spare some coins. As I was searching for some loose coins, a child had walked up to me and asked if I would be willing to spare some coins so she could get something to eat for her little siblings. I smiled and gave her most of what I had so she would be able to feed her and her siblings for 2 or 3 days. She smiled and hugged me, and as she turned to go and feed her siblings, a man stood in front of her, and she had bumped into him. As she did this, she dropped her money, and the man looked like a rough vagrant. He then picked her up, apologized, and helped her pick her money up. I was shocked that he not only helped her but apologized for her bumping into him. Another man that was well polished and groomed looked in disgust at them. He scoffs in their direction. How could this fine place ever fall from grace? He turns and makes a remark. Those who don't work or have money should be put down like the dogs they are. As he said that, the child began to cry, and then he chuckled as he got in a carriage that was waiting for him. The man then wiped away the tears of the child and spoke in a calming tone. It's okay, lass. He doesn't understand how we are, and one day he'll regret this by the kindness that we bestow on them. He finished, and the child stopped crying and looked like she was smiling and hugged him as he handed the last bit of money to her, and she walked off happy. He smiled and watched him go to where she needed to and walked into an alley. I smiled and went to the nearest paint shop. As I walked into the shop, I saw that everything was colourful and beautiful. I looked around and I laid eyes on the perfect colour. I then went up to the shopkeep to purchase it, but I didn't realise that I had less than I had previously thought I had. I then went to put it back, but the shopkeep let me take it because I was the only one who gave the girl money so that her siblings wouldn't go hungry. I thanked the man and went back on my way, and the world became brighter as I walked back home. Time had passed as I walked towards my home. I saw the same man who was cruel in his words towards the nice folks in town. He was broken down and stranded in a place he didn't want to be in. I wanted to leave him stranded where he was, and wanted to make him feel small, but I remembered what the homeless man had said, and my conscience wouldn't let me leave him. I walked up to him and offered my help. He scoffed at me for even mentioning the fact that I offered. The stagecoach spoke, telling me that the wheel came off. I then just spoke with him, and we both went to find the wheel and brought it back, and I helped them be on their way after the wheel was put back on, and the man thanked me quietly as they went on their way. I then went on to my home, and as I went in, I started adding colour to brighten up my world, as Petter said. Hours went by, and I was proud of how it turned out, then went to rest so I wouldn't be tired on the trip to help out with questioning the suspects with Petter and Edward. The very next day came. Officer Petter came to get me, and with him was Officer Edward in the police carriage. Unfortunately, I still had to ride in the back because I was still a suspect in this ongoing investigation. So who do we question now? I asked the officers. Well, we have 7 people to interrogate, so it'll more than likely take all day and probably all night, Edward responded. Petter then spoke. Actually, we only have 6 to go now. Petter also responded. Edward spoke in a cross tone. How so, Petter, How do we only have 6 more people, huh? Tell me that, Edward roared. Petter spoke in a calm tone. Well, we already interrogated the surgeon, so that's one done. So that's why we only have 6 people to ask questions to, and the question still stands. Who do we question next, Edward? Petter responded in a serious but gentle tone. Edward just glared at Petter and didn't respond because he knew that he was wrong but wanted to be right. It was a long and silent ride all the way to our destination. To my surprise, we made our way back to the crime scene, but we had to go next door to talk to the neighbour to see if they had seen or knew anything. Edward banged on the side of the carriage and demanded, "Okay, get out, Batchumber." I rolled my eyes as I got out of the carriage, fixed my coat, and then walked over to the front of the carriage and spoke. "I need Officer Petter to accompany me." Edward had a smug look and mockingly spoke. "Why do you need him for, huh?" He paused to chuckle. "Too scared to go alone, Doctor?" He finished. I spoke in a serious tone, but with a hint of sarcasm. "No." I paused to have a slit smile. "Because if I don't have a police officer with me, then I'm just some weird man coming up being nosy about something that I shouldn't be, wouldn't I? Does that response suffice, Officer Edward?" I finished with a sarcastically Edward, then began to look cross as I spoke to him and proceeded to look forward. Petter then turned to smile and hopped off the carriage and began to walk with me to the residence door. I knocked and a young man had opened a door to greet us. "Yes, may I help you?" he asked with nervousness in his voice. Petter smiled and spoke softly. "Yes." He paused as the young man had a slit smile and became more comfortable speaking to us. "Are you the owner of this house, young man?" He finished asking no. He paused to collect his words. "I'm just here to help out the owner where I can. Why do you ask?" He wondered. I spoke. "Well, there was a murder next door and we wanted to know if the resident knew anything about it." The young man just looked with a face of worry. "Aye." He paused to try and use the right words. "Well, I don't think, Here, just come on in and I'll show you what I'm trying to say." He finished sheepishly. We both went in, and what we saw was a reminiscence of a once great house. Both looked in awe at how it looked, and pondered how it would look before whatever had happened to it. We then followed the young man up the stairs and into a room. As we went in, it was dark and covered with bookcases all over the wall. Some were cooking books and the other majority were psychology-based. All had a great amount of dust on them, but not enough to cause someone to lose their breath. The young man gestured as he spoke. "Here's the homeowner." He finished. I fixed my gaze on the chair and saw a woman, and as I thought to greet her, I then realized that she was a vegetable. The young man saw our faces and spoke. "All she does and can do is just look through that window. I come and clean, cook and dust for her. I even take good care of her. Sorry about what had happened and wish I could be more help." He told us in a sorrowful tone. Petter spoke up to ease the tension and to bring up the spirits of the young man. "That's more than enough. You even helped us get a step or two closer to our culprit." Petter told the young man, "Thank you for your time and sorry for the inconvenience." I finished. He smiled and spoke. "Any time. Glad I could help a little with your case." He responded gratefully. We left and told Edward we were too done and that we could move on. He had asked us what the owner looked like or how they were. I explained to him what she was and he began to laugh. Edward then began to make jokes about the ordeal that would even the ones who made jokes in bad taste would be in disgust. I spoke to change the subject. "So where to now?" I asked to try and clear the air of those horrible jokes Edward made. Edward thought for a moment and spoke. "I'd say a friend now." He responded. Petter then asked, "Who was she friends with?" Edward responded, "Probably other prostitutes, so that'd make it 2 birds with 1 stone. I spoke. "Then we wouldn't get much detail on her." Edward spoke. "Oh yeah?" He asked. "What makes you say that, Batchumber?" He finished questioning me. I began, "Well, we'd only get one side of the coin and not get to see the other side." I responded. Petter smiled and thought that was a great response. "I like it." He began, "Let us go check with the family member and friend first, and then we'll go and talk with the prostitutes for questioning so that we can get both sides of the coin without going out of order." He finished with a bit of pride in his voice. Petter told us that idea, and it made a lot of sense than going and jumping around a lot like how Edward was originally planning for us to do. Edward then looked upset and spoke. "The plan sounds just too long and could cause us to lose time and maybe even the real culprit that we're looking for." Edward explained. I spoke up after he finished. "Well, by doing Petter's plan, we would be doing more by moving less, plus we may even get a routine of how they were along the day and night. So by doing Petter's plan is more sound than your plan to go back and forth, Edward." I finished. He began to think about the 2 plans and came to a realization that Petter's plan was way better than his own. It grew silent as it had before, but this time it wasn't as long as the one we had previously. It took an hour to get to the victim's family. I had been pondering the thought of how we were going to tell the family about their angel selling herself to devils for money. We had arrived at the home she was born to. Edward remarked on her, "She left this place to become a whore. Well, home sweet home then." He finished his remark in a mocking tone. I was disgusted with his words and his motives. I just tried to ignore his ignorance, but he just kept getting under my skin. Edward waited in the carriage while Petter and I went to do the questioning. I began to speak as we were a good distance away. "Petter," I asked, "how do you work with this man or even stand him with him being this way?" I asked him agitatedly. Petter then began to answer, "Because they thought that I'd put a good impression on him, but he refuses to listen, and also I'm the only one who is able and willing to tolerate him." He finished. I wasn't expecting to hear that. I just looked at him wondering how someone so good could exist. He just smiled at me, and I responded with a smile back, and we had made it to the door. I began to knock on the door, and to my surprise, it began to slowly open on its own. The smile on Petter's face then began to fade as he placed his hand on his gun and unhooked it, hoping that he wouldn't have to use it, and to be better safe than sorry. Petter led the way as we both entered the room where the door was opening to. It had a damp feeling to the air and the room was very dark. The only light was coming from a room across from us, and as we went closer we began to see a person sitting in front of a window. We moved slowly but surely toward the person, and paused as I had noticed that there were bandages on their head as if they were covering their eyes. We both moved even closer to the person, and saw that it was an elderly woman looking out the window with covered eyes, as if she were hoping to capture a glimpse of someone that she was waiting for. She spoke in a sorrowed tone. "I know why you're here." She spoke sounding sadder than when she began. Petter mustered up enough strength to speak to the elderly mother. "Ma'am." He began to lose the strength he had to speak, but spoke with a sorrowful tone. "We are sorry to have to tell you this." He paused to gather his words. "But your daughter is—" Petter tried to finish, but the lady put her hand up to stop him from finishing because she had heard all that she had needed to hear. She began, I know she was murdered, she started, but she was no prostitute. She finished with what looked to be tears but had a tint of red within them. I then began to speak. If you don't mind, I started, how do you know if she was or wasn't one? I finished nervously. She turned in the direction I was in as if she could see me. Peta and I were in shock as we saw blood spots where her eyes were supposed to be. She cleared her throat to speak. I birthed her. She replied with sadness in her voice once again. My husband and I raised her up. She became a nurse. She paused to collect herself before she began to cry. Her work address is in my left top-hand drawer. You'll find the doctors and her friends she worked with. She paused to take a big breath. That should help you with the murder case. She finished. Peta went to get the item, but instead of taking it, he made a copy so that we'd have something to go off of, and if it were to get damaged or stolen, we'd have a backup plan to retrieve another copy. I turned back in her direction after I'd seen Peta make his copy and saw that her gaze was fixed on me as if she could see right through me. I shivered because for some reason I became scared. She spoke to me. It's okay, child. She began, I know you'll capture her killer. She finished in a soft-spoken tone. She smiled and Peta told her not to worry and also made sure that she didn't need anything before we left. After that, we both headed back to the carriage. As we made a ways away from earshot, I had to ask Edward something. Did you see those bandages on her eyes? I began. He responded, I know. He started. They were hard to look at, but it's a good thing that she was still able to shed a tear. He finished. I became worried and asked what colour her bandages were and the tears. He had responded that the bandages were white and the tears were clear. I then began to wonder if what I saw was just my nerves getting the best of me, or if this case has put me under more stress than I had thought. He looked worried as he saw my face, and I explained that it must have been the tears that discoloured her bandages because of the dampness, and he sighed in relief and just brushed it off as a doctor thing and patted me on my back, saying, It's okay, Dr. Water tends to do that, and smiled. I could only imagine what you thought, my friend. We then made it to the carriage and told Edward what happened and where to go next. He didn't understand at first, but after explaining it again, he understood, and we finally made our way to the ward to where she worked at to gather more information on who we were dealing with. It had taken us 5 hours to get to the ward that we needed to be at. Edward spoke. So how do we know that she didn't sell herself to the doctors or to the patients she cared for? He started. Or maybe even after work, huh? Maybe she did it to get a high and tried it with the wrong person. He finished with a smug grin. I got irritated with his remark about a dead girl. Probably because she had class and not to mention a good home instead of resorting to that vulgarity, I replied angrily. Edward's grin grew bigger. Just because she had class doesn't mean she wasn't a high-class whore. People with the best of homes aren't immune to the stupidity of being human, and not to mention. He spoke the last part in a mocking tone to imitate my voice. Did I ask you, Mr. Batchumber? He finished with a look as if he had won something. Edward thought that he had said something that made him sound clever by saying his words harshly and by mocking what I had said, but Peta replied quicker than I could respond. Well, to be honest, you didn't exactly specify who you were talking to, so with what you said before was a bit clever to say you made it invalid by showing your ignorance. Peta finished explaining to Edward. I held back a chuckle, and Edward's smug grin faded and turned into a hateful look, and turned his head to look forward and kept quiet. I got out of the carriage and noticed that Peta was looking uneasy at the sight of the ward our victim used to work at. I calmly spoke to him. Is there something wrong, Peta? I asked caringly. He looked ill with all the colour nearly gone from his face. No, He paused to collect himself, and Edward looked worried for his partner as he noticed that he grew quiet. I'll be down in a moment, He spoke in a scared tone before I stopped him. It's okay, Peta. I'll go and talk to the doctors and nurses. I began with a small smile. I'm used to being around patients of this degree. I finished reassuring him that I was going to be okay. The colour began to come back in his face and had a small smile. Thank you, Jack. I appreciate what you're doing. Peta finished with gratefulness in his voice. Edward then looked back in his usual demeanour and then spoke to cover up his caring sense for his partner. Hold up, Doctor. He started. So why are you going in without him? Are you trying to cover up a mistake that you made, Dr. Batchumber? He finished rhetorically. I noticed his switch and spoke as if I didn't notice at all. If I were to really cover up anything, do you really think I'd have killed you already, or have killed you at the station and snuck out in your outfit, officer? I finished and he just looked away after he gave me a dumbfounded look. I rolled my eyes and then began to walk toward the gates. As I walked down the path to the ward, I saw that the colour began to fade as if there was a shift in the tone of a story. Everything began to become dull and faded. The flowers started to look as if they were wilting before my eyes. As I got closer to the gate, I grabbed a bar to open it, but all that happened was that it broke off the gate's door. I then pushed on the door as hard as I could to just nudge it to open a little bit. I had to push with all my might just to open the gate's door because of how rusted it was. As I went through the gates and got closer to the ward, I felt that shadow presence begin to creep up again and looked behind me to see who was there, but there was nothing, and I began to walk again. I wondered to myself, why is this place so barren? There have to be people here, isn't there? I pondered. As I put my hand on the door, I heard screams as if I heard them when I was young and swung open the door. I saw a child sad and crying because he didn't want to be there. The image vanished as one of the doctors came up to me. The doctor spoke. "Excuse me," he started. "Can I help you with anything, sir?" He asked in a confused tone. I realized that I must look mad, but I tried to quickly correct my posture and asked him, "Yes, actually." I started with a nervous hesitancy. "Do you by any chance know of this woman?" I finished. The doctor looked at the picture, and a look of horror came over his face as he realized who it was and began to tell me if he knew her or not. He spoke with pain in his voice as he rubbed the back of his neck. "Yes, I know her." He started off and paused to clear his throat. "She's or was a nurse who worked here. Her name was Elena." He paused to collect himself as he covered his mouth and looked saddened by the picture. "She had worked in the intensive care along with the nuns." The doctor finished his response. "Why? What happened? Is something wrong?" he asked in a scared tone, fearing for what he may hear. I struggled to say what I had to she. I began, "Has been murdered." I paused to let the terrible news sink in so he had time to accept what I had said unto him. "I, along with other officers, are looking into the investigation on who it may or may not be." I finished. He looked shocked. "Murdered?" He paused to collect himself before he shed a tear by covering his mouth. "Why for? She was the nicest woman that God has ever given us." He questioned. I rubbed the back of my neck and tried to put together the right words to say without coming off as a rude man. "Well, Jack the Ripper got to her and—" I started, and then a nun interrupted me by entering the room furious. "My child, are you implying that Elena was a lady of the night?" She finished angrily. I stammered over my words. "Well, Jack the Ripper's motives are usually women of the night," I replied. The nun was still irritated about the assumption of the victim being a lady of the night. "Forgive me for saying so, but you are wrong about her." She spoke her mind. "Mister?" She finished by asking for my name. "Dr. Batchumber, miss, and you are?" I replied, and in turn I asked for her name. She looked stunned that I was a doctor and that I was a polite one. "My name is Mother Suprema," she answered. "Now follow me, doctor." She continued. I followed her, and as we walked further down the hallway we were in, I began to see some horrible things. I see people bandaged from head to toe, a man with half his body gone, a woman with no arms nor her legs. The child I had seen before appeared again as I peered into a room. He was clutching a teddy bear, and then a nun came by to help him on his way. Why am I seeing this? Why am I seeing this, and why does it feel like I'm remembering this or even seeing those images if they aren't even my memories? Mother Suprema stopped and stood in a doorway of our path. She took a deep breath. "Doctor," she spoke. "Yes, Mother Suprema," I answered. She took a saddened look and spoke. "Look in this room." I then walked towards the door, and to my surprise I was shocked to see the victim alive and in patient attire. She's just sitting in her bed, staring blankly at the wall next to her. I looked puzzled as I spoke aloud. "How?" I started as I started. "Wait, she's—" I paused as I realized she was her identical twin sister. The shadowy figure grabbed the back of my neck and shoulder as he began to speak in a deep, raspy voice. "Can you hear her? Can you hear her screams as they mistreated her for years?" It spoke as if I were the only one that could hear him, and then out of nowhere, the screams he was talking about came flooding in. I looked around to see if anyone else heard the wails that came from her blood-curdling screams, and then I saw her flailing about in her bed, screaming and begging for help as she got louder and louder, as if she were begging someone to stop hurting her. I saw the shadowy figure form itself into the shape of a man with his face covered with a mask made of old rags and bloodstains. He was sharply dressed and turned to me with a Cheshire smile and said, "Isn't this beautiful? She has a lovely voice, don't you think?" He spoke as Mother Suprema spoke to break the silence, and all of a sudden the figure vanished as if he wasn't there. She was a lady of the night while her sister was an apprentice here. She did all those deeds just so her sister could work here full time. She spoke sorrowfully. I cleared my throat and spoke. So what happened to her to make her be in this state? I wondered, if you don't mind telling me, that is. I finished. She appreciated the thought and began to speak. The man who owned her, so to speak, branded her like she were his sheep. She wanted out and her employer didn't like that, so he made sure she wouldn't work ever again. Mother Suprema finished with some tears falling from her worn face. It was insane how people were in this world, but then again there are so many horrible things that occur. So maybe the Ripper made a big mistake, or it was an imposter trying to be him to get some recognition, or just for some attention however he could get it. I took a minute to digest what all was told, and I spoke. I'm sorry to intrude on you like this, but may I ask for her name? I asked Mother Suprema. It's okay, my child. She started to speak. Her name was Elizabeth. She finished and covered her mouth to hide the face she made as she answered. Was? I began, sounding shocked. What do you mean, was? I finished with a puzzled face. She looked at me with sorrow in her eyes, then spoke. Well, now it's Sugar. She answered while covering her mouth from letting out a noise of sadness. I noticed that what all was being sad had caused her to relive things that she may not want to have relived. Thank you for your help, I replied and turned to walk away. I then saw the same child from before, but this time I saw an insane patient grab him and throw him into an electric therapy chair. He laughed as the child cried and pulled the lever to turn on the power. As the child was being electrified, I tried to run and save him, but to my surprise I was paralyzed and had a scared grin forced on my face, and as tears rolled down I was stuck motionless, just only being able to stand there and watch it all unfold in front of me. My head was forced to look and follow as a nun ran up behind the patient and hit him from the back of the head with a pipe wrench. The patient fell to the ground and the lever was pulled down as he fell and turned off the chair. She limped over to the child to see if she was too late. The child was okay after she got him out. He leapt into her arms, tears running down both their faces, and she had ripped clothes and was beaten up. She held on to him tightly, promising nothing bad would happen now. I felt relieved until I saw the patient grab the pipe wrench and bash the side of her head in. He smiled a devilish grin and glared an insane look at the child. The child screamed in terror and the patient dropped the weapon and leaped towards the screaming child as he wrapped his hand around the child's neck to strangle him. As he landed on top of the child, he began to laugh maniacally as he started to raise the boy up so he could watch him squirm and to watch him go limp as the light faded from his eyes. Miraculously, the child was able to kick the patient between the legs and was dropped as the man howled in pain. The child began to run away. The patient managed to trip the boy. As the child fell, he looked frantically and saw the caved-in part of the nun's face. He began to cry as the patient gritted his teeth with a murderous glare fixated on the boy. The child then kicked the patient's face and he saw the patient slowly look back with a sinister grin with a busted lip. "Now I'm going to eat you, you little brat," he roared monstrously to the child while laughing maniacally. I tried to move toward the boy to try and save him, but was forced back to the same paralyzed stance, forced to watch this morbid scene. The boy became scared for his life as the patient grabbed his leg and began to pull him closer. The child then saw the pipe wrench and grabbed it. "I'm going to fry you up and eat you." The patient roared and laughed as he slowly pulled the child to him as to savor the moment. As the boy was dragged close enough, he swung the pipe wrench with all the strength that he could muster, landing a hit on the crazed patient's head. He then reared back in pain as he stood up. He held his head as if he were trying to stop it from becoming undone. The boy swung again, but this time he aimed for the patient's knees. As he connected with the pipe wrench, the patient fell to the ground. He was only able to see out of one eye, and as he looked, his eye got wider as he saw the boy rear back the pipe wrench for another blow. The boy hit him on the other eye to force him to fall back. Howling in pain, the patient lay there on the ground with no eyes to see with and a broken knee joint. The boy jumped on top of the patient and began to hit the patient over and over and over again. The boy screamed and cried each time he landed a blow on the patient. A doctor found all three of them in the darkened room as he worried that it may have been too late for the boy and the nun. He looked horrified to find that the boy was still screaming and hitting the dead patient's caved-in head while he was covered in blood. The doctor teared up as he had to force the child off of the corpse and fought to get the pipe wrench away from the boy. Another doctor had to help and put a straitjacket on him to try and restrain him. The boy was then put in a padded room and locked away for everyone's safety and his own. The doctor walked away and another nun prayed for the boy as he was still screaming and crying from the traumatic experience that had been bestowed upon him. She turned, and to my amazement, it was a younger Mother Suprema. As she walked towards me, she faded, and I came back to reality with tears in my eyes and heavy breathing. As I fell to my knees trying to catch my breath, the shadowy figure re-emerged as the masked man from before. He got close to my ear from behind me after he re-emerged and spoke in a deep voice. Well, what do we have here, Dr. Batchumber? He spoke in my ear softly. I rose up fast, staggering to my feet as he scared me when he spoke. I could feel his devilish grin and I can see his piercing glare with his demonic black and red eyes. He continued to glare at me with those petrifying eyes. So you're trying to figure out if I had done this, aren't you? He paused to let the silence seep in with the dark tone in his voice. Jack, he finished with an unsettling tone. Well, look no further, 'cause here I am, and here's a present from me to you, Dr. Jack Batchumber. He finished while speaking in a showman's voice. He placed his hand on my shoulder and stabbed me in the gut. I was shocked and felt the blade become warm as he twisted it inside me, and then he chuckled as he jerked the blade out. Fortunately, I was able to move, but unfortunately, it was when I fell on my knees and coughed up blood. I looked up as he stared down at me and asked, "Why?" He kneeled down beside me and stared into my eyes as if he could see right through me and replied, "How else could I have told you?" He paused as if it were a play to let the dramatic pause sink in. "You had to know my story," he finished gleefully. Then he grabbed me by my collar and pulled me closer for him to whisper something in my ear so as to tell me a secret. "There's some I don't want to be hurt," he stated in a serious and harsh tone. "So go and find them for me before they die and the imposters get away, Dr. Batchumber." He finished in a darker tone and then threw me back as he vanished in the dark. As I lay there coughing, the doctor from earlier rushed up to me. Doctor, are you all right?" he asked as if he were oblivious to my blood-stained mouth and gashed stomach wound. I looked at my stomach and my hands weren't bloody. There was no wound to be seen. I could have sworn that I was stabbed, nearly gutted by a masked man. I responded to the doctor, puzzled. He looked at me with a worried look, then gave a nervous chuckle as he smiled and said, "Don't worry, I was just an illusion. This place can turn the sanest man to lunacy." The doctor finished the doctor, then helped me to my feet. I dusted myself off and embarrassedly thanked him and went on my way. As I walked back to the carriage, I began to see the world around me twist and be warped. I got to clear my mind. I spoke to myself. I don't see how Elena could have tolerated this godforsaken place. I pray I'm never coming back to this monstrous, horrid place. I finished my thoughts. After walking through the wilted, colourless garden, I made it back to the carriage pale as a ghost. Petter worriedly asked, "Are you okay, Jack?" I looked up and I met his face that looked worse than mine had been. I put on a fake smile and spoke, "Yeah, I'm fine. Thanks for asking, Petter." I replied, hoping the smile worked. Petter turned back around a little more at ease. Edward was silent the whole ride to the next stop. He broke the silence. "So what did you figure out, Doctor?" Edward asked calmly. I was shocked that he asked me in a pleasant tone. "Well?" he asked in an annoyed tone. "Oh yeah." I paused to take a breath and to collect my words. She wasn't a prostitute. She was actually employed there. It was her identical twin sister who was the prostitute. The poor thing was just at the wrong place at the wrong time. I answered Edward. Edward looked angrily shocked and knew I was telling the truth as he gave me a sudden glance. Petter, on the other hand, looked as if he were about to cry. Petter cleared his throat and tried to hold back his sorrow. "The sister?" Petter began to ask, "What of her, Dr. Batchumber?" He finished asking. I rubbed the back of my neck, not wanting to tell him what happened to her, as I asked, "Do you really want to know?" I replied, and saw the very moment that Petter's heart sank to his stomach as he shed a tear. Edward saw that it bothered his partner, but regrettably spoke, "Please tell us." He paused to stop himself from becoming angrier than he already was. "What happened to the sister?" He spoke sternly. I gathered my words. "Well," I began and had to swallow the scared tone in my voice back. Her pimp turned her into a vegetable, all because she wanted out after she got the money that she needed for her sister to get a full-time job as a nurse. I finished my answer. Petter looked more terrified and shocked. Edward then made a screeching halt, for we were at our next location. I looked out and saw that it was a place that looked to be abandoned. Edward hopped off the carriage and opened my door, then gestured for me to get out and follow behind him. Edward looked at his partner with empathy. "Petter," he spoke softly but sternly, "stay here. We can handle this one." He finished in a caring but firm tone. Edward then nodded. Edward took off his hat and rolled up his sleeves as we entered the building. He then hid his badge and handed me his brace knuckles. I looked surprised. He rolled his eyes. "Don't get the wrong idea. I gave them to you so that I don't use them. I don't want to hurt someone more than I have to because I have anger issues. Is that all right?" He spoke in a concerned tone and looked at me from the side. I nodded and he half smiled and stopped in his tracks as he put his hands on the doors of the entrance. "So what was her name?" He asked. "Her name was Sugar." I replied. He took a deep breath and pushed the doors open. As the doors squeaked open, I began to see people drinking, and some of them were doing drugs. I felt disgusted and angry in this place. As we walked in, we made our way to the bar. Edward gestured for me to stay here to see if anyone knew Sugar or her pimp's whereabouts. I took a look all over the place and secretly thought to myself, such deviants. It's no wonder there are people like... I paused. Wait, why am I talking like this? Must be an after effect from the asylum. I finished my thoughts and tried to calm down. After I took a minute to calm down, I saw a man talking to a woman. He's drunk and she's a waitress. He's trying to flirt but is failing, and terribly at that. She smacked him when he pulled her closer. I laughed a little and then it stopped as he then stood up and towered over her. He then backhanded her, causing her to spin around and fell on the table adjacent to him. He then smiled and spoke. "I'll teach you. Yeah, little putz." As he laid his hands on her to do God knows what, I was surprised that no one even tried to stop him. I had seen enough and made my way toward him. I grabbed his shoulder to turn him around, but it did nothing but make him angry. As he turned toward me, he rose up and towered over me. I noticed that I might not be enough to take him in a fight, and secretly put my hands behind my back to put Edward's brace knuckles on and prayed that I wouldn't have to use them. He looked glaringly at me. "What do you want, Pipsqueak?" He spoke boomingly. I cleared my throat and spoke. "Now is that any way to treat a lady, sir?" I asked. He then laughed in my face and the people in the building laughed, joining him. "Just who do you think you are, huh? A hero," he said mockingly as he laughed, and the other people's laughter got louder. I looked annoyed and spoke. "I'm Dr. Jack Batchumber. I'm a surgeon and you need to stop what you're doing." I finished confidently. The towering man spoke. "Oh, looky here," he began. "We got so educated lad, huh? Well, sorry, sir, I'll stop." He finished clearly and earnestly. I was thrown back by his response. "Well, that's goo." I started, then got interrupted as he sucker-punched me in my gut. He and the rest of the group laughed at me as I fell to the ground. I looked up and saw the despair, distress and helplessness on her face as she shed tears. I then felt an urge that had never occurred to me before. I felt anger and rose up, then roared, "Hey, back off the girl or else, you fat loke." And as I said those words, he turned to me enraged. "You never learn, do you, lad?" he began. "Well, I guess I'll have to teach you." He finished to try and intimidate me as he threw the first punch. I dodged his attempt to attack and hit him square in the nose, and he went backwards. He landed on a stool, breaking it while his arms held onto the table he landed against. I then began to feel angrier. I grabbed him by his collar and began to wail on him. The place went silent as I hit him, and the only sound was my hits connecting. I grew a smile as each hit landed, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, I realized what I was doing and looked at my fist and saw that it was covered in blood. I looked around, breathing heavily, and saw that everyone stared at me in fear. I looked back at the man and let go of him, and he fell to the ground. I went back to my spot and ordered a drink. I began to shake. I took my drink and it calmed me down a bit. Edward came out and saw the blood on my face. He then saw the brace knuckles cracked. He rushed over to me and spoke. "Batchumber, are you all right?" "What happened?" he asked, concerned. I began to answer, but the girl spoke. "He was protecting me from this man. He saved me." She spoke confidently. Edward looked around and saw the faces of everyone and how scared they were, and then saw them quickly turn as he took handcuffs out and put them on the man and took him to the carriage. He came back into the building to get me. I drank the last pint that I had and stood up to fix my clothes. The girl gave me a cloth to whip the blood off of my face, and as I did, she gave me a kiss on my cheek as a thank you for coming to her rescue. I smiled and kissed her hand. "'Twas nothing, ma'am." And as I did that, she smiled as I walked out the door to get back in the back of the carriage. There was a divider between me and the behemoth. "Did everything go well or get any new leads?" Petter asked nervously. I started to speak, but Edward spoke before I could. "Well," he started, "Dr. Batchumber over here cleaned this bloke's clock and just so happens to be the man we were looking for." Edward finished Petter, then looked surprised and smiled, knowing everything went according to our plan. Edward leaned back to speak to me. "Well, I hate to admit it, Doctor, but you've got one mean temper," he began. "I didn't think you had it in you to do that," he finished proudly. "Well, I used to box in college." I spoke and felt Edward smile in approval as he leaned back up to drive the carriage. I was later dropped off at my home. It was a long day and I needed some rest after what I'd done and had been through. I went up to my bed and fell in. As my head hit the pillow, I closed my eyes for a second, and as fast as I closed my eyes, I heard a loud banging at my door. I fell out of my bed as the banging continued. I rushed to my feet and ran to the door to see who it was. It was Petter, and he looked frantic as he spoke aloud. "Jack!" He started in a scared tone. "You have to come with us. Something has happened to the girl at the hospital." He finished in a scared tone. I rushed to straighten myself up and hurried out the door and into the carriage. Edward hurried us to the asylum. He came to an abrupt stop as we were moving faster than we had to go. We all hopped off the carriage and rushed to the doctor and saw that Mother Suprema praying and scared as if she had seen something unforgettable. I looked over and saw a bloodied door and couldn't hide my scared look. I walked down the hallway that led to Elizabeth's room. As I made my way there, I could see more of the room and saw that she was cut in half. Her eyes were laying on the ground along with her lower half, while her upper half was strung up with her hands nailed to the wall. I was shocked by fear and fell to my knees. Petter ran to me, and unfortunately his eyes met with what the room had inside it and pulled me away. Edward bolted to see what was the matter. Petter gestured in the room and he rushed in to see and was frozen in his tracks, horrified at what he saw. He struck again, or they struck again. I felt so appalled that this happened. I just feel so sorry for the one who has to come and clean all this up. We go back to the carriage after we gathered a statement from the doctor and whoever else who may have had access to or seen the crime scene. Petter is emotionally ill from what he had seen, but Edward, on the other hand, was furious. It has to be him," Edward spouted off. "He's got to be behind this. He's the only one who knows she was in that state. It's got to be him, I know it. I can feel it in my bones." He finished his tangent, enraged. Petter just sat there with no expression on his face and said nothing. It worried me. He did just have a traumatic experience, so maybe he'll have to stop being a police officer. We then rushed to the police station and Petter got off the carriage and I quickly followed after him to catch him if needed, and we stayed in the lobby. Edward ran to the pimp's cell angrily after he jumped off the carriage. I helped Petter get to a seat and tried to calm him down from the horrible scene that he saw. He smiled slightly as I stayed with him to comfort him. Edward roared, "No!" Petter and I both ran toward his angry cry. I ran as fast as I could but stopped as I noticed Petter had to stop to catch his breath. Petter gestured for me to go on ahead and that he was okay. I nodded and went on. As I made my way to Edward, I saw blood on the walls, then found him on his knees looking angry and pounding on the ground as he repeatedly said no, and I looked in the cell and saw that the pimp was mutilated. His chest and gut were torn open with his guts sprawled out across the floor. His face was frozen with a petrified look. He was our only lead, the only one we had to go off of, and now look, he's dead! Edward roared angrily. I then went back to Petter and he looked worried. "What's the matter, Jack? What happened? Where's Edward?" he asked worryingly, and looking around and out of breath I stopped him from going further, and he noticed that I was trembling and put a hand on his shoulder. "The pimp was murdered. He didn't stand a chance in hell for what happened." I spoke, trying to hold back my fear. Petter then grabbed me and pulled me in for a hug. He reassured me that everything was going to be all right. I raised my arms slowly and hugged back, and all the emotions rushed out and I broke into tears. Hours had gone by, and Petter resigned from duty. Edward thought it was best considering how caring Petter is. We then headed back to Petter's home to drop him off. Everyone was sad he had to go, but it needed to be done. We all went to his home and stayed a while. Edward made sure that Petter was all right. "I'm fine now, Edward," he explained and reassured his old partner Edward, then rubbed the back of his neck and asked, "So what'll you do now that you aren't an officer?" He finished genuinely. Petter smiled. "Well, my wife is an excellent baker, so maybe start a bakery," he said proudly. Edward and I both had a smile. Edward liked the idea. "Well, I guess I'll stop in once it's up and get my free baked goods on my former partner's discount." He spoke jokingly. Petter chuckled and said, "Don't worry, partner. First order's on me." He spoke proudly. We all laughed and had a good time before Edward and I had to leave. We said our goodbyes and went on our merry ways. But little did we know it was the last goodbye we'd ever say to each other. As the next day breaks, I got ready and looked in the mirror, and for once I could smile and like the day, or so I thought. I took a step outside and took a deep breath, then began to walk towards Petter's home for a surprise visit. As I began to walk closer and closer, I heard noises, and then heard my name being yelled. "Jack!" The voice yelled, "Batchumber!" The voice sounded closer. I turned and saw Edward speeding towards me. I waved, but he stopped and looked terrified. "Get in now. I'll explain on the way." He finished in a panicked voice. I didn't hesitate and jumped on and told him to go as I held on. "Something's happened to Petter," he began. A beaten-up woman came in and said she saw the man and was immediately attacked after. There were 3 rippers. 3! He spoke angrily. I thought back about the victims and realized there were 3 different ways each of the victims was murdered. Surgically brutal, the brutal crucifixion, and then brutal mutilation. We arrived and I jumped off the carriage before it stopped. I landed unstably and fell as I tried to continue running. I got up quickly after I rolled and into the building to find where everyone was. I prayed that the girl was okay. I couldn't find anyone and ran up the stairs, and to my horror, the halfway was covered in blood. I looked and couldn't believe my eyes. I fell to my knees and tried to hold back my cry, but bellowed in sadness, and Edward heard me as he was looking for anyone. He charged upstairs and found me in a broken doorway. He rushed up to me, looked inside, then pulled me away from the horrifying sight. He roared in anger. He punched the wall, and after he helped me up so we could both head downstairs. As we both made it down, he told me to wait here while he went to go get back up to help find the culprit. As he left, the room began to darken, and a smoky shadow appeared. The masked man emerged from the shadows behind me and stood beside me with one clawed hand on my shoulder. I felt scared of the dark, shadowy presence. I turned to look at him, and he was already staring at me with his devilish smirk under that horrifying blood-stained mask. He continued to look at me with his demonic glare with those piercing black and red eyes of his. He then had an angered look and locked eyes with me with a more terrifying glance. "I warned you something like this would happen, didn't I?" He spoke in an intimidating voice. "Now I want—" He began, but I interrupted him and spoke. "Find those monsters, bring them to their knees, make them pay for what they did here," I finished demandingly as I put my hands on his shoulders. He had a surprised look and threw his head back, laughing maniacally, and grabbed hold of me and held his head down. "Why are you laughing?" I asked, scared and angry. He rose his head up with his signature grin and spoke. "That's all I needed to hear, Jackie boy." He finished with a chuckle and walked out the door. I turned to see nothing there, and the room began to lighten up. I fell back into a chair and grabbed my head as I thought to myself, what have I done? I just signed a death certificate. Time had passed since Jack told the Ripper to do a deed that could never be brought back from. The Ripper went to the imposter Ripper's location and started to pick them up one by one. He found one of the imposters in a padded cell and sedated him with enough tranquilizers to put him in a sleep-like coma for hours. Then he went and found a man not too far from where he grabbed the first imposter. The last was the woman who claimed to see the whole occurrence of when Petter and his family were attacked and miraculously got away in time to tell the police. He then found a building to his liking and placed them all inside and decided to wait for the woman to wake up. She began to twitch and move, and she started to open her eyes and felt a pain in her head like she had been hit with something hard. "Time to wake up, Mum." A voice spoke as a woman opened her eyes. She began to panic but was muffled due to her being gagged. She looked around her looking for her kidnapper, but he was behind her. She froze with fear as he put his monster-clawed hands on her shoulders. She looked up to see him looking down at her with his piercing gaze and devilish grin. She looked petrified. She shivered as he moved closer to talk to her. "Hello, love. Wonderful day we're having, isn't it?" He spoke in a warped voice. She began to cry as he sat in front of her, moving his hands slowly across her, and chuckled. "You know?" He started and looked off in the distance. "I didn't mind you taking on my legacy. I actually like the idea that I'm larger than life, that I'm an eternal terror on Earth." He paused as he looked into her eyes to drive in a point. "The living devil." Jack the Ripper spoke with a warped and twisted voice. His smile scarred the woman. He then ripped off the gag and folded his hands, then rested his chin on them. He smiled as if he took a liking to her. She looked at him with tears running down her face and spoke. "Please let me go. I promise to never do this again. Honest to God, I promise to never ever do this again." She pleaded and begged. "Oh ho ho, I know you won't do it again, my dear." He replied with a grin. She looked as if he took pity on her, showing mercy as she spoke. So you'll let me go? She begged Jack. The Ripper smiled as he leaned in closer. No, he replied. She looked confused as to why he was being this way. Why? But I promised. Why? She begged for an answer once more as to plead for her life. He suddenly got closer. Did Sister Tilma get a second chance, Mother Suprema? He spoke as a whisper in her ear. She looked horrified as she knew who it was. Jack took off his mask to reveal his face. He looked demonic with his cracked face that looked as if he was still burning on the inside. His black and red eyes along with his smile are all a bad combination for the faint of heart. He placed the mask on the table, and as it touched the table it was like you could hear the screams of all his victims that came before. How? But you were just a boy. What happened to you? She pleaded. He smiled and spoke. Oh, what can't you tell? He paused for an effect. I was tormented by you and that deranged doctor of yours. You set that man after me and Tilma. He paused again to collect himself from getting too heated. She was so nice to me, and then you set your rabid dog free and you took away my means of living and laughed, he roared as she turned in fear. He stared and looked in awe. So you're scared now? Is that right? Well, how do you think they were when you got to them, my sole survivor? He told her as she realized he knew she tipped the police on the slaughter. You knew? She asked. He met her shocked look with a smile. Well, of course I did, he replied with excitement. You did it all in one go. You didn't pace yourself. Very sloppy of you, Sue. Jack the Ripper finished with ease and a crooked smile and a tilted head. Mother Suprema's look worsened as time went on, and as he got close she got paler. He leaned in to put a covered plate in front of her. She slowly looked down. He then took the cover off and she saw that on the plate was human meat. She let out a blood-curdling scream and tears ran down her face again. So you're too old to carry out these murders, so you talked that doctor and another insane asylum patient to do your bidding. Now eat. You need to keep up your strength. He spoke as he force-fed her spoons full of human meat. Please, I beg you, please stop. Mother Suprema begged and pleaded. Jack stopped and began to laugh for a moment, and then made eye contact, and like a flash he grabbed her by the mouth and spoke. So ho-ho! He started. Why'd you do what you did back then, Mother? Why kill her? Why torture me? He continued. She didn't deserve that. Jack roared and demanded an answer. She heavily breathed and looked at him and cried, I'm so sorry, Jack. Can you ever forgive me? She started. Can you ever find it in your heart and for... Mother Suprema began, but Jack the Ripper interrupted her by placing both hands around her head and proceeded to bash it on the table enough times for it to break her eye socket. Forgive you, he began in a frustrated and angered tone. Forgiveness isn't something that I do, O righteous hand of God. Jack finished as he laughed. She made a face as if someone had wronged her for no reason at all. He then brought her head back up and met her eyes with an evil, cynical look. So answer my question and I'll let you go, okay? You have my word as a gentleman. He spoke in a censor tone of voice. She took a deep breath to gather her words. I wanted her gone. She began, That's the truth. You getting tortured and becoming insane was never a part of the deal, nor was the death of Sister Tilma. Now please let me go. Mother Suprema pleaded. Jack the Ripper then smiled and broke her neck, causing her to be paralyzed from the neck down. You promised, she screamed. Jack chuckled as he spoke. Oh, no, you got me all wrong. I am letting you go. He spoke softly and paused as he leaned closer to her. I'm letting you go straight to hell. Jack finished with a roar as he ripped out her throat. She tried screaming for help, but the only thing that came out was muffled screams and blood. He then sat next to her and spoke. The reason I killed you here today is not that you had it coming. He paused to turn her head towards him. It's because you took the two most precious people away from me, Sister Tilma and Rebecca. Oh wait, that's right. You didn't know the second woman's name, did you? Heh, oh yeah, that's right. You don't take the time to know your victim once you've had a taste of blood, do you? He spoke in a mocking tone as she became more scared by each word that came out of his mouth. One loved me as if I were her own child, while the other gave me hope for people, because she took pity on a poor man in the streets and gave him food and sweets to give him just a little bit of energy. So I guess I should thank you for giving this world its most infamous killer to ever live on God's green earth. Jack finished telling Mother Suprema, ignoring the urge to rip her head off. He then got up from his seat and fixed his clothes while he made his way to the closet in the corner of the room and drug out the doctor's half-body remains. He then slammed the body on the table carelessly and jammed a fork in his eye as a work of art. "Ha! Aye, Captain," he muttered to himself as he saluted the doctor mockingly and then went to another room and grabbed the patient dressed as the imposter Ripper. Jack sat him at the head of the table and left to make an anonymous tip about the whereabouts of the imposter Rippers. Jack the Ripper smiled and left the room as Mother Suprema died of her throat being ripped out and spoke. They lacked finesse, so they had to go. He finished as he walked away in the night, never to be seen again, or until he feels the need to come back. The police had apprehended the so-called Jack the Ripper. It took 10 men to take him down and into custody. He was set to an immediate execution by the district of Whitechapel. No one wanted to go near him. Everyone was afraid to even look at him. Edward, on the other hand, wasn't scared so easily. He made his way to the lever because he was the only one willing to go near him. It was probably because the man in the chair killed his partner and his loved ones. As he held the lever and pulled it, he spoke. "Rot in hell, you monstrous son of a—" He spoke, but was drowned out by the man's screams. People then cheered as the terror was finally over. Jack Batchumber got up from his seat and fixed his clothes and his tie, then walks up to Edward to give him a handshake. Both then bid each other farewell. Years pass and Edward is now chief of police and has a son named Petter in memorial to his late partner and my late friend. I went back to being a surgeon for a while. I decided to stop and open up a bakery called Rebakery and named a sweet after Alexandra called Dra Cakes. They're little cupcakes that are rich and sweet like she was. Edward would bring his family in and we all would have a great time and reminisce about Petter and his lovely family and even some funny stories that we all have had. As I said, this is a story where I, Jack Batchumber, was accused of being Jack the Ripper. I never said I wasn't now, did I? The end.